reviewing the scientific literature to answer your questions about gender diversity. This is Classroom Psychology. And now here's your host, Dr. Cora Sargent. Hello everybody and welcome to Classroom Psychology. I'm your host Cora. Thank you so very much for joining me. It is wonderful to see you. It's Wednesday, it's Classroom Psychology Day. It's great to see you. Hop on in here. Let's talk about gender diversity. And this week, much like we do every time we come together, we talk about, we take a question from a public figure or politician or book author, and we take their often publicly very confident declarations for the questions that we're sure they're intended to be. Come on, I mean, they're intended to be questions, right? Who would make such confident statements without it being a question? So we take it for the question we hope it was intended to be, and we look to the literature to find an answer. And this week, no different. We have a question from the legendary Stella O'Malley, who's psychotherapist, public speaker, and book author. I think she's published a few different books on parenting and mental health. The most relevant book here is When Kids Say They're Trans. And listen, you got to hear the blurb for this. This is a book for parents, and it talks back to the ideological capture of gender confusion with refreshing, non-nonsense candor. Hey, no rainbows and unicorns. It's no rainbows and unicorns. Absolutely brilliant. Listen, we'll take Stella's question, whatever it may be, for the question that we're sure it was intended to be. And we'll take a look and see if we can't find an answer together. So here is legendary psychotherapist Stella O'Malley.
Unusual insofar as we're in a weird world where doctors, philosophers, feminists, middle-aged mothers and psychologists would be picketed for asking questions, because actually that's our most common theme is we have questions because there's a very low evidence base. The mental health of these people do not seem to be improved by medical transition. And so it is a strange world that doctors and clinicians and academics are being picketed.
Thanks so much to Stella O'Malley for such an interesting question, posed, as they often are, in the form of confident declaration. I really like this question because this confident declaration followed a statement about they get picketed for asking questions. Absolutely brilliant. Hey, I can't believe we get picketed for we're just asking questions. Oh, but here's a statement. Here's a statement about how medical transition doesn't seem to support the mental health in this community. Hey, but we'll take it for the question I'm sure it was intended to be. And we'll see if we can't find an answer. And now, we've already talked about medical transition in a previous episode, right? We talked about affirmative care and the evidence base for affirmative care. We've covered. It's a fun episode. Do go back and listen if you're interested. The evidence base is way stronger and way more prolific. Like, there's so much evidence out there, much more than I thought there would be. And I think that has kind of roundly answered that particular question. But I still think there's a question here that we haven't yet really answered. And that's the question about social transition. Now, I know Stella O'Malley's question is sort of more focused on medical transition, but I think it's related. Social transition is the act of transitioning socially. Well done, Cora. That's what we call circular logic. The act of social transition. So we've already talked about the three kind of elements of gender that make sense to think about gender in the context of, right? Biological configuration, gender identity, and gender expression. Biological configuration is how your body is configured in relation to gendered anatomy. Gender identity is, that's right, that feels like home, that's what I am. And gender expression is your personal and social performance of your gender. Now, when we talk about medical transition, as transition is supported by the medical community using the tools available to them, and that is about changing biological configuration in some way, right? Primary and secondary sexual characteristics. But social transition is about changing your performance of your gender. And a lot of folks never take steps in medical transition. I think there might even be some evidence that it's the majority of people who don't take steps in medical transition, but do take steps in terms of social transition. Even, gender diverse communities, many of whom engage in social transition, not a huge number of humans still engage in medical transition. I'm not totally sure about the stats most recently, but certainly historically and in the literature we're going to review today, certainly it seems like the minority of folk engage in medical transition. So here's the question then. Does changing our performance of our gender affect mental health and emotional well-being in some way? How does it affect, like, sans medical transition? Now, of course, we got to bear in mind that these two things are not mutually exclusive, right? Like, social transition is often supported by medical transition often supported by social transition. And until recently, in fact, you kind of had to engage in social transition in order to access medical transition. It was only the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, which is the WPATH standards for care, which is like the international best practice guidance for transgender healthcare. They talk about, or they used to talk about in previous versions of their standards of care, the real life experience, which was a requirement for people to engage in essentially social transition for a period of time without medical support in order to qualify for medical support. That was then changed about 18 months ago in, I think, version 8 of their standards of care. They changed it and removed that requirement. But until very recently, trans folk had to go through that. And, you know, gender diverse folk more broadly, anybody engaging in transition related healthcare. And I had that too. So when I went to see my first psychiatrist in the gender identity clinic, he was like, listen, you're going to need to engage in real life experience. You need to present as femme in all places in your life. You need to change all your documents. You need to engage in kind of, you need to transition socially everywhere. And I was like, I think that's going to be tough. Like, I think that might be difficult. To be honest, I was quite early in my own thinking about what I wanted to do in my life, and I was really worried I wasn't going to be employable if I engaged in full transition everywhere. Certainly not if I didn't have the support of hormones to do it, right? Because, you know, without the support of hormones, you know, I had a bit of a more chiseled jaw. My hair was coarser, my skin was thicker. You know, I was masculine in appearance, and it was incredibly difficult. Like, it took a lot of work to engage in full social transition before I got access to hormones, but I freaking did it. Because that guy, you know, that psychiatrist wrote to me and he was like, "Oh, secondary transsexual," which is the maybe one of the, like, my least favorite ways of being referred to. And he was like presenting androgynous stroke feminine. And when I read that, I was like, screw you. Screw you. I'm going to come back for my next appointment. I'm going to work on every aspect, and I'm going to come back and I'm going to get hormones. Like, that's what I'm going to do. And so, you know, one of the things that I did, you know, it's difficult. Social transition is hard in those moments, like early social transition. This is what we're going to find here. I think transition is a bit of a double-edged sword in this regard, because while social transition can be very positive, I think, in terms of the outcome, social transition can also lead to a couple of particular problems. The first is that there's a lot of steps to early transition that are quite challenging to go through. Like, I had a beard. I had a freaking beard, you know, and hormones don't really do a huge amount with the beard. Apart from, like, testosterone absolutely creates it. I did not consent to my body producing a bunch of testosterone and pushing me through a male puberty, but what choice did we have back when I was young? And so I, you know, had a beard, and I had to deal with it in order to kind of present femme in any way that felt right to me in the mirror. I needed to get rid of the beard. And so I did. I had intense pulsed light to remove it. And the intense pulsed light is like, basically, you put these dark glasses on, they come at you with this bright, like, red flashing light in a gun that they fire at your face. Literally, it's quite scary and super awesome. And it works best if you have dark hair, and it works best if you have light skin, because the skin then reflects the light and the hair selectively absorbs it because it's the darkest thing around. So it absorbs the light. The heat transmits down the follicle and burns the follicle and prevents the hair from regrowing. I had to do that for like 6 months. It cost me £1,500, no joke, over months and months and months and months of treatments. And here's what's wild, right? While you're taking it, of course, you have to let the hair grow before each round of intense pulse light. You do it monthly. I did it monthly. It took 2 weeks-ish, maybe a week of letting the hair grow so that it could be like fried with the laser, with the light. And then afterwards, you weren't allowed to shave for a week to let the hair, to let the sort of skin recover. So for a good 2 weeks of every month, I had a full freaking 5 o'clock shadow. Now, I don't know about you, but social transition in those contexts is incredibly difficult. That was the time when, I had to get a police officer in my living room because I was getting sort of like shouted at and threatened by a bunch of people outside my house, my flat. That was the time when I was starting to get shouted at in the street, and it was a difficult time, right? But when you enter into those grey areas of gender in a world that's extremely binary and quite hostile towards gender diverse folk, that's really tricky. And then, of course, like learning what your body is like, learning what looks good to you on your body, it takes time, it takes work. So social transition is quite a challenging process, as well as being beautiful and liberating. And in those moments of electric euphoria as you see yourself for the first time, that dream made manifest in the mirror, that's a beautiful thing. But it's also quite challenging, right? So I think we're going to see that here. And I think also we're going to see that, not only is it challenging because of the sort of internal challenges of, trying to be femme in the world when your body isn't quite conforming, or being masc or being non-binary in the world when your body doesn't easily conform. It also exposes you to the trans prejudice of environments, right? To the sort of the discomfort with violations of heteronormativity that flow around all around us. So, minority stress theory is going to apply here. And then, of course, the mental health of this community is obviously affected by a bunch of other things like employment, financial stability, support at home, parental support. All of that is going to be shaky for this community, I think. So all that's going to become relevant. But here's the question, right? Holding all that in mind, does social transition, the act of changing the performance of our gender, affect mental health and emotional well-being in some way? And if it does, how? Let's take a look. First thing that's super interesting about this literature, I took a look, as I always do. I looked for basically any gender diverse folk, transition, and mental health, and a bunch of related terms. And I tried to grab all the articles. There were 450. I read all the abstracts of those articles to kind of identify which ones are going to be relevant. And I scooped those up, and we ended up with like about 20 studies that I read in total. So 20 full texts read. So it's quite a big field. This often only be like 4 or 5 studies that really can answer our question. And we focus on those. Sometimes there's more, particularly in the early episodes, but there's a lot here. Here's what's really interesting. This research is almost exclusively focused on children and young people. It kind of makes sense, though, because if we're talking about transition in adults, like Vigni Pao and colleagues in 2021, they did this gorgeous systematic review in the Journal of Gay and Lesbian Mental Health, where they looked at specifically suicidality and suicidal ideation in transgender folk, and they found this huge number of articles, like 52 articles across 3 databases, and they concluded that, transition does support mental health. But they, again, like even in that big systematic review, it's quite difficult to delineate between social and medical transition, because like I described, right, the real life experience for me was kind of forced social transition before I could engage in medical transition, but that was only 6 months worth of of social transition, right? So the time between my first and second appointment at the gender identity clinic was 6 months. And in those 6 months, I worked my ass off and did a bunch of stuff to try to engage in social transition as fully as humanly possible in order to get to the other end. It was terrifying. But 6 months later, I saw the next psychiatrist and he was like, would you like to start hormone replacement therapy? And I was like, tried not to sort of giddily laugh in his face affirmatively and just said, I think that's right. Yes, I think it's time. Just about. But it was only 6 months. So when you're talking about adults, right? Social transition and medical transition, if they're going to engage in medical transition, adults engage in medical transition fairly soon after engaging in the process of social transition. So my guess is that it's not so easy to delineate. Whereas if we're talking about young people, for a lot of young people, social transition is all they have access to. And for some young people, they have access to medical transition, but often that can, particularly when we're talking about children, they might engage in social transition for many years before engaging in medical transition. And then we can actually start to delineate the effects of social and medical transition separately. So a lot of this literature is based around children, young people, which is kind of fun, actually. It's kind of interesting. I actually think, as I was reading through this literature, the ultimate end we're going to arrive at is that children socially transitioning earlier have a better time of the whole experience because they don't have the challenges of adolescence engaging in social transition. If you imagine what I described of my own experience, I was 28, right? And I was around full adults. If I had tried to do that when I was 17, 16, whatever, young person, the world would have been so much harder on me for it, because adolescence, as we've already described, is a time of pretty extraordinary victimization and bullying. So, young people trying to do this for the first time in adolescence actually have a really tough time. So it's really interesting as we look through this research. I think that's probably where we're going to land. But there's a good deal of research looking at adolescents and children. So let's take a look. Our journey begins with Toma and colleagues, 2023, perceived gender transition progress, gender congruence, and mental health symptoms among transgender adolescents. So they brought together a bunch of transgender adolescents, basically 3,318 in total from the Gender Minority Youth Study, which is a large, nationwide, across the United States, online survey of mental and behavioral health among adolescents aged 14 to 18 across the US. All 50 states were represented, including Washington, D.C., and included 990 trans-masculine youth, 132 trans-feminine youth, 640 assigned female at birth non-binary adolescents, 84 assigned male at birth non-binary adolescents, 97 adolescents who were questioning their identity, and that gives us the 1,943 transgender adolescents who ended up in the final sample for this particular piece of research. 67 of them participants identified as white, 7% as Black or African American, 9% as Latinx, 3% Asian American or Pacific Islander, 2% as Native American or American Indian, 1% with another race or ethnicity, and 12% identified as multiple, with more than one race or ethnicities. So of these just shy of 2,000 people, quite a diverse sample across the US, they asked, thinking about your ideal gender expression, what percentage of transition milestones have you already met? 0%, I have made no steps in my transition that I would like to make, all the way up to 100%, I have made all the steps in my transition I would like to make. And then they asked them a bunch of questions about mental health symptoms, including generalized anxiety disorder from the GAD-7 scale. They asked them about depression in the Center for Epidemiological Studies depression scale, and they measured gender congruence too. And this is where they set themselves apart from all of the other research in the field. Why I want to focus on this one particularly, because they also looked at gender congruence. So they asked, basically asked people to range on a Likert scale. My outward appearance represents my gender identity. Response options ranging from strongly disagree to strongly agree. Now, their theory was that transition goals improve gender congruence. And gender congruence, then, somebody like their outward appearance. This is pure social performance, right? This is pure performance stuff. My outward appearance represents my gender identity. Supported by medical transition, for absolute sure. But, this can be just about like social transition. So this is about like, does my outward appearance, my performance of my gender represent my gender identity on the inside? And here's the point. They thought that maybe transition progress like basically supported gender congruence, and that might influence depressive and anxiety symptoms. And indeed, that's what they found. So the first thing to say is that people assigned female at birth who are non-binary, they had better transition progress, generally speaking, than anybody else in the sample. Non-binary folk assigned male at birth then had slightly weaker transition progress. Gender questioning folk had weaker, and trans femme participants had the weakest kind of transition progress, generally speaking, which one assumes is like a consequence of like natal hormones, right? Like I would imagine incredibly difficult, generally speaking, for people assigned male at birth who go through a male puberty to feel positive about their transition. Add a guess here. But what they found was that transition progress was very strongly related to gender congruence. How far somebody had got through their transition, how their personal transition milestones, their goals, the number of those that they had met was strongly related to how congruent they felt between how they looked on the outside and how they felt on the inside. And that congruence was then very strongly predictive of both depressive symptoms and anxiety symptoms. Now, this is really interesting to me. They found that transition progress wasn't really related to depressive or anxiety symptoms once gender congruence had been taken into account. So they found that social transition and medical transition, quite possibly for a number of these young people, but the act of transition helps people to meet transition milestones, meet transition goals, and those goals support their gender congruence, right? Those milestones support them feeling good about themselves on the outside as matching how they feel on the inside. And that then alleviates depression and anxiety. Absolutely massive. And again, these are young people, right? These are like 14 to 18-year-olds. And they need, like, this is a wonderful thing. Like, it improves anxiety and depression by improving gender congruence. Transition is a good thing, seemingly, at least on that study. Now, Cal Horton in 2022, we can take a look at, what does this mean then? Like, what is the experience of transition like, and the outcomes of transition for 30 parents of socially transitioned children in the UK? So Cal went and interviewed 30 parents of trans kids in the UK. And I think they're quite young kids, actually. Their children had socially transitioned at around the age of 7 years, with a range of 3 to 10 years. And at the time of parental interview, their children were age, on average, 11, with a range of 6 to 16 years. So again, young people, but who had transitioned fairly young. 90% of the participants were white, 93% women, 23% disabled. And the vast majority were between the ages of 40 and 50 years. And this is what they said of their children. So there's a bunch, this is a cool study. I'm actually a big fan of Cal Horton's work generally. Lots of qualitative work, seems very high quality to me. Cal is able to get some amazing responses from participants, and the direct quotation is pretty stunning. And so we'll look to those quotes now. So in that study, there was a bunch of different themes generated, but the one that's relevant here is the kind of the emotional consequences of transition, post-transition, if there is such a thing. But having engaged in transition, what are the emotional consequences for these young people? So here's the quote. She was a really, really angry toddler and young child, and almost all that dissipated with transition. It was brilliant for him. It was brilliant for him. The meltdown stopped. She changed overnight. back to this bubbly, vivacious child that I hadn't seen for a couple of years. And she just continued, she's dancing down the street, singing all the time. She's just sunshine. So the switch in gender pronouns in there, it was brilliant for him. It was brilliant for him. The meltdown stopped. Was the other parent potentially misgendering their child? But hey, if they're anything like me, family gets a free pass. Another brilliant quote. I'm just going to go through a bunch of quotes that I copied in here because it's so good. And I think it was from that point she was so happy living fully as a girl. And then it was like, right, off you go to school in your boys' school uniform. And pretty much weekly from that point, it seemed to be in the bath. She'd say, when can I go to school as a girl? When can I go to school as a girl? In the sense that it made her happier, yes, it was a huge deal for her. She was miserable going to school in a boys' uniform. Honestly, it was a fight every day. The day that she was allowed to go in a dress, she was up and ready for school, before I'd even got out of bed. Yeah, it completely changed her life. So we were there, sat at the end of normal parents' evening, and there was a teacher and the student teacher there. And I said, oh, my child, protecting the name of the child, wants to tell you something. She would like to wear the girls' school uniform to school. And he said straight away, not a blink, that's absolutely fine. And my child's reaction was to burst out crying. She just burst out crying, leaning into me. That first bit of acceptance from outside the family. The teacher went, no problem. After we finished, do you want to go and change the label on your school peg? The label on your books and all that sort of stuff? And he, my child, literally grew a couple of inches in his seat when he saw what was going on. Then she said, is there anything else you want to say? And he said, I want to be a boy. I want you to call me him. And at this, she balked. And she went, why don't we try that in September? And he shrunk down. His grip got hard, when he was holding my hand. And I just looked at him and I just said, no, we change everything now. We do not have the right to say you can change your name, but you can't change your pronoun. He knows what he wants. He's absolutely certain we're changing his pronoun. The social transition bit at school, I guess, in that period from September to January was hard in terms of managing it. And then it got easier because then I wasn't worried about are we doing the right thing? It was clear that we were doing the right thing. It was crystal clear that she was happier. And she was happier even though she was dealing with a lot more, difficult stuff from her peers. And just the benefits were so clear to her, to see who she was and her behavior and her attitude and, little things. Like she'd been really slow to pick up reading, but I don't think there's a coincidence that literally within a couple of months of her transitioning, she was reading. And by the end of the year 3, so a year after social transition, she'd caught up and began to overtake her peers. That's that kind of how much her brain power had been given over to existing in a world that didn't see her as who she was. And when she was allowed to be herself, all other aspects of her life kind of began to catch up and fall into place, as they should have been. The school, did notice this massive change in her. She had no interest in school whatsoever. She wasn't doing very well, but now she's just a sponge. Now she's not worrying about gender stuff as much, and she's able to concentrate and give her opinions freely in class. She's actually doing really well in all the areas of school. It's like it's freed her. I don't know about you, I absolutely adore Cal Horton's work. Stunning, absolutely stunning. And while the quant work clearly suggests that mental health of this population is supported by social transition, and that social transition supports their gender congruence, and that's the kind of big boy variable that seems to be doing all the heavy lifting. Like it makes people feel congruent within themselves, and that's what helps. Now we can hear from Cal Horton what the effects of that is, that young people engaging in transition are happier, that they're better engaged in school potentially. Like that's the mechanism for specific children. Like they seem happier, some of these kids, right? We can't make generalized statements about Cal's work very easily, but for sure we can see how the experience is felt by these young people and their parents. It's kind of beautiful, right? It's amazing. Now, Durwood and colleagues Mental health and self-worth in socially transitioned transgender youth. This is a really cool study because, again, we're looking at quite young people who are engaged in social transition, and some of them have a little bit of medical transition going on as well. We'll talk about that in a second, but most of them are just engaged in social transition. And here's the question: does it impact on their emotional health? So this sample was drawn from the Trans Youth Project, which is a longitudinal study of socially transitioned transgender children from across the US. And they come from 23 US states and a Canadian province, 22% from Pacific Northwest, 18% from California, 6% from the Mountain States. They're really representative all over the US and even in a Canadian province as well. And of these young people, so they had 63 transgender children, 63 age-matched controls, and 38 siblings. All of them were 9 to 14 years of age. All of them, like of the trans kids, had socially transitioned, and they all completed the depression and anxiety measurements that the researchers asked them to conduct. And of those participants, 39 had received no medical intervention, 18 had received hormone blockers, and 5 had received cross-sex hormones. Bearing in mind that in the UK, they're too young to receive cross-sex hormones. None of them would have received cross-sex hormones in the UK, would be my guess. They might be old enough to receive hormone blockers, I think 9 to 14, some of them, but the vast majority received no medical intervention at all. And they found that of these children who had transitioned, so basically, kids who socially transitioned, they could compare them to both age-matched controls who were matched to them in a bunch of different ways, and they were compared to their siblings. So they controlled for the environment when comparing them to their siblings, right? Raised in exactly the same environment. And they found that these transgender children reported normative rates of depression and only slightly increased rates of anxiety. Now, the rates of depression in the transgender children didn't significantly differ from those of their siblings and those of age-matched controls, although the rates of anxiety were marginally higher. Again, I think social transition, particularly when it comes to adolescence, can be quite anxiety-provoking, so I'm not super surprised that there's a bit of anxiety in there, but it's kind of reassuring, right, that these kids had relatively normative levels, like fully normative levels of depression, and only like marginally elevated levels of anxiety, which is pretty wild. Now, they also measured, they had a slightly different sample, 116 trans kids, 122 controls, and 72 siblings from 6 to 14. They managed to get a larger sample to complete the self-worth measures, basically, and comparing them, the trans kids didn't differ from age or gender matched controls to their siblings or to their age and gender matched controls. They didn't differ from either group in self-worth, which is awesome. So, social transition, supporting these kids to have normative levels of depression and self-worth and only mildly elevated levels of anxiety. On to the legendary Kristina Olson. I love Kristina Olson's work. Listen, one of my all-time favorite researchers. In 2016, The Mental Health of Transgender Children Who Are Supported in Their Identities, published in Pediatrics, which is no small journal. So included in this study were transgender children who had, these guys, there were 73 of them in total, mean age of 7.7, so quite young. 22 assigned female at birth, 51 assigned male at birth, 70% white and non-Hispanic. So quite a diverse sample, actually. Quite young, and they must have identified as the gender opposite to the gender they were assigned at birth. They needed to identify as either male or female, though, so they had to be kind of, in a sense, binary transgender. They needed to have engaged in full social transition, so they were present in all contexts, at school, in public, as the gender identity they feel they are on the inside. They needed to be using a pronoun matching that gender, and they needed to be between the ages of 3 to 12. And they couldn't have started puberty, so they were excluded if they had started puberty. So they had ultimately 73 transgender children, which is not a bad sample at all given the tightness of the criteria. And then they got 2 control groups. So they got one control group of 49 siblings, mean age of 8.3. And then they got a group of 73 typically developing children with no history of cross-gender behavior at all, mean age of 7.8. So they had these gender and age match controls. Bearing in mind the gender match controls, they compared trans girls to female controls and trans boys to male controls. This is a classic move from Christina Olsen and Celine Gilgo's. Appropriate gender matching like that is actually fairly rare in this field, and is really positive to see here because it's a much better control group than like comparing trans girls to control boys feels really unhelpful. I don't think that makes sense really. So symptoms of anxiety and depression, then, they measured in these young people, these children, using the National Institutes of Health Patient Reported Outcomes Measurement Information System Parental Proxy short forms. Whew. Basically, they asked parents to report on the anxiety of depression symptoms that they saw in their children. And what they found was that prepubescent transgender children, so transgender children, who had socially transitioned, again, had slightly elevated rates of anxiety symptoms compared with the population averages, but in terms of depression and anxiety compared to controls, they did not differ from them on either measure, from either types of controls, whether it be siblings or the age and gender match controls. They did not differ from them. So the transgender children supported in their identities had like these anxiety and depression symptoms that were well below even the preclinical range. So they had comparable to the controls, and they had anxiety and depression symptoms that were were as low, generally speaking, as the wider population. Slightly elevated anxiety compared to the wider population, but not compared to the control groups. So that's kind of interesting. It kind of explains why, in a sense, that slightly elevated rate of anxiety also found in Durwood's work, kind of spotted here with Christina when she's comparing to the wider population. Super interesting, but not when comparing to the control group. So given the high rate of anxiety and depression in transgender populations, generally speaking, including children, what they are finding is that when children are allowed to socially transition and supported to do so when they are transgender, that might be associated with better mental health outcomes among that population. In particular, Celine Gilgo's, Christine Olsen says, allowing children to present in everyday life as their gender identity rather than as their natal sex, in inverted commas, is associated with developmentally normative levels of depression and anxiety. Super, super, super interesting to me. So what do you know so far? So far, we know that social transition occurs. It happens in children and young people. People engage in social transition often long before they engage in any kind of medical transition. And when we look at social transition specifically, we find that for sure, those folks who engage in social transition have what seem to be developmentally normative levels of depression and anxiety, and that is a good thing. Hey, that's pretty great. And we think what might be causing those improved depressive and anxiety symptoms might be gender congruence at the helm. That when people embody themselves and their internal gender fully so that their external presentation matches how they feel on the inside, they experience a kind of gender congruence that alleviates the depression and anxiety that is otherwise caused by gender incongruence, right? In a sense, is not surprising. We talked about gender dysphoria before as being a bit of a pickle, and a bit of a pickle might be a little bit understatement, but that gender incongruence can create all kinds of challenging contexts for trans kids and for trans adults. And here we have evidence that social transition may be a pretty good intervention, bearing in mind that social transition is fully reversible, right? Social transition is just how we perform our gender to ourselves and to the world. And a person can absolutely stop doing that or do that in a different way at any time. whether a person engages in social transition and if it alleviates anxiety and depression, if it makes them feel happy in the world, as Cal Horton found, right? If it helps them to feel happy, then why not? But there is a caution here. Now, Turban and colleagues, 2021, timing of social transition for transgender and gender diverse youth. Now, this was published in the Journal of Adolescent Health. We've talked about this study once before when we talked about the bullying episode. This study came up again completely independently as just searching literature, and I was like, oh, is this one again? Now, this again is from the USTS. We've seen this before, this massive national US survey, 27,715 participants, transgender folk all coming together to answer questions. And they found that of the 9,711 included participants, 165 reported social transition in childhood and 1,196 reported social transition in adolescence. 8,000 reported social transition in adulthood. So of the people who transitioned socially in adulthood, in adolescence, or in childhood, we can delineate the difference between like the long-term outcomes for those people emotionally. And here's where things get dicey. Now, content warning, we're going to talk about suicidality again, deepest apologies. It just is, all of these studies kind of highlight the suicide rate of the community is absolutely enormous. Somewhere between 40 and 50% have ever attempted suicide of transgender communities generally, which highlights the sort of need for social transition if it supports these things. And that's why it ends up being such a focus of all these studies, because this is like the big outcome factor that we want to focus on, right? We want to reduce suicidality for this community. So they found basically they controlled for confounding variables, they controlled for all the demographic variables, and they found that specifically social transition during adolescence was associated with greater odds of lifetime suicide attempt and past year suicidal ideation. Now, you might be like, why in adolescence is that the time that it's really bad? Well, we've talked about this study before in the harassment and bullying episode, right? It's not surprising that that's what's happening here. In their post hoc analyses, they basically had a look at the exposure to harassment for this population, for this sample, and they found that people who transitioned socially in adolescence were more likely to have been exposed to harassment based on gender identity than those who had transitioned in adulthood. And after additional adjustment, they found that none of the adverse mental health outcomes remained statistically significant when harassment was taken into account. So they basically found that it's a pretty solid study. The reason why adolescence is associated with this like lifetime suicidal attempt and past year suicidal ideation increase is because social transition and adolescence creates the context for harassment and victimization and bullying to take place. So this is fascinating, right? Put all together, we find that what is really interesting is that social transition is abundantly positive for trans people, right? It improves the anxiety and depression that's often very elevated in this population, and it reduces suicidality and suicidal ideation. It improves the emotional outcomes of this population. But there's a kind of critical period in which it becomes challenging, and that's adolescence. And that's because adolescents are nightmares for harassment and bullying. And so what we find, here's what's really interesting, is early intervention seems to be quite important. If you have a young person who is genuinely transgender, who knows in childhood, if we prohibit social transition until they reach adolescence, which I think is somewhere on the cards, right? Like people like even the WPATH guidelines talk about like gender identity becomes a bit more fixed in adolescence, and in childhood we're not, it's quite fluid for a lot of kids. And therefore maybe we should refrain from transition into adolescence. But if we do that, then we expose them to the challenges of bullying and harassment when they first start to socially transition in adolescence. And that is associated with lifetime increase in suicide attempt, lifetime, and past year suicidal ideation in adult participants who are looking back on their adolescence. So these are lifelong effects. Now, ideally, maybe in a perfect world, we would say, well, maybe the right thing to do is to transition early in adolescence socially, because that's when, gender identity becomes a bit more fixed and we can be a bit more sure, and young people can make the decision for themselves more capably because they're a little older. But if that's only a good idea if we can reduce the bullying of this population. And given the extraordinary effort that we have taken, like as a whole educational community, to try and manage bullying and harassment in adolescence, to no avail, like to no success. Bullying and harassment in adolescence is as bad now as it has always been, despite our efforts. I don't know that that's a good answer to this question. I don't know that waiting till adolescence therefore helps. I don't think that's a good idea. I'm just reading this literature, and I think those people who are in a position where they feel like insistent, consistent, persistent, who want to engage in social transition in childhood, I mean, based on this evidence, I think it's probably okay. Like, the emotional outcomes of social transition seem quite positive for the trans community, and it seems like they have better outcomes than those who transition in adolescence or adulthood. I mean, and people who transition in adulthood, people who wait till adulthood, that's the majority of people, clearly the vast majority of people who just don't tell anyone until they're adults, who don't transition until adulthood. But those folks are in distress throughout that time. And we know that the suicide rate for the trans community is extraordinarily high. The emotional well-being of this community is not strong. So, surely creating space for these people to find themselves in the world and embody their truest, most secret self as soon as they feel okay to do so. I mean, not moving ahead of them at any stage, just allowing them to find what's right for them. I don't know. I tend to think that's okay. Now, there's a beautiful study here. Vingli Pao and colleagues in 2021, suicidality and non-suicidal self-injury among transgender populations, a systematic review. We talked about it a little bit earlier, the Journal of Gay and Lesbian Mental Health. Now, part of their study, they looked at young people below the age of 25, and they looked at adults too, and they found two really big findings that I think are things that we need to bear in mind, right? The first is the importance of social support, and the second is the importance of school support specifically. So they say the importance of social support as a protective factor for suicidality was reported by several qualitative and quantitative studies. In contrast to these findings, high rates of family rejection and not being able to access practical support, like described as someone being able to call someone for help with everyday things, were associated with increased suicide attempts. Several studies reported that family was the most important form of social support. In both Australia and the United States, gender-related bullying, victimization, and rejection by their peers were associated with increased suicidal ideation and suicide attempts in trans youth. Similarly, Parr and Howe from 2019 found an association between increased suicidal ideation and frequent microaggressions by peers. Conversely, feeling safe at school was identified as a protective factor for suicidality. So it seems like our job, bearing in mind, kids are gonna engage in social transition at very different ages, depending on when they come to the realization on how supportive they think their environments are gonna be, how welcome their breadcrumbs have been when they've been found by people. But our job, in amidst all of this, is to make sure that young people who are engaged in social transition have all the social support they need, and to make sure that schools are fully supportive, to make sure that school is a place where young people can, be, can live freely and openly, not being victimized or discriminated against. And together, maybe we can make a world where everyone can find a place to belong. Thanks so very much for joining me. This is Classroom Psychology, and you are extremely welcome here, as always. And hey, I look forward to seeing you, as always, in the next one.